Fantasy races are a core element of most fantasy settings and can range from a handful of different races to a wide variety of different inhabitants of the world we hold dear. There are the classic Tolkien-inspired races like dwarves, elves and halflings, but there's nothing hindering us to come up with our own ideas and interpretations of folklore, tales and myths to create our very own fantasy races and bring them to life. But before we open the chest and see what I got for you today, riddle me this. What is so fragile, even speaking its name will break it? A tip? You will not find it in this video. Write your guess in the comments, I will give you the answer in the next video, as well as a shoutout for the first one to get it right. Welcome adventurer, my name is KorokDM and I create videos about D&D and world building. I try to upload on Thursday every second week and will be live streaming some fantasy map making on every off week. Today I want to give you 8 thoughts on world building fantasy races that always help me when I'm creating or implementing them in my worlds. This is not a direct recipe for making good fantasy races. See it more as different angles from which you can approach them to make them more interesting and give them more depth. Number 1. Set yourself a world building goal. The first question you should ask yourself when world building races in fantasy settings is, what do you want to achieve with this race? There will be a reason you feel the need to add a new race or integrate an existing one. This reason should be in the center of your further world building. Don't feel forced to add different races just for the sake of adding them. This leads to them getting bland and your world becoming oversaturated. Reasons for adding a specific race might differ greatly depending on whether you world build for written stories or to create playable races in Dungeons & Dragons or other TTRPGs. What is the story you want to tell with this race? Did they play a special role in the history of your world? Do you have a clear picture of a character or NPC that you want to give a certain flavor that none of the other races so far can deliver? Or, my favorite, to explore a certain area of your world and lore by populating it with a thematically fitting race or subrace. If you want to integrate the races from the player's handbook or other sources, give them a real place in your world. Change them as you need them lore-wise to make them your own and ask yourself, what is the reason for this race? What are the stories that could be told with their presence in your world? They should be more than just a different combination of stats and abilities for the players to choose from, but a gateway for them to immerse themselves in the world you created. Number 2. Think about how you handle tropes and cliches in your world building. Tropes are like the common understanding of your fantasy world. They provide easy access for people to your world, because if they know the trope of the grumpy dwarf, they know that they can probably befriend them with a pint of ale. However, tropes can be a slippery slope where players just assume them to be true with no regard for how things actually are in your world. In the worst case, tropes make your world feel bland, like it's just one of the other generic fantasy worlds out there. If you use tropes, give them a twist to add your own touch or even change things up completely. Dwarves don't have to be mountain dwellers, they could as easily be seafaring traders. Humans could be a minority race scattered across all kingdoms without a real home of their own, in contrast to them being the common race you can find everywhere in most settings. The important thing regarding tropes is to establish as soon as possible how you use them, so that players can't just assume them to be true. You can tell them upfront what to expect, but even better, to show them in-game with an early encounter. When they see 1 or 2 tropes with a twist, they will become wary of just assuming them all to be 100% true. A common trope for YouTube is that I'm obliged to tell you to like and subscribe for more D&D and world building related content. And don't forget to ring the bell to get advantage on perception rolls to never miss out on a new video. What are common fantasy tropes that you like or don't like? Do you use them or do you think they are too cliché and try to avoid them if possible? Tell me in the comments. Number 3. The difference between race and culture in fantasy worlds. One thing that is often confused in world building is culture and race, especially for races other than humans. There should be a difference between 2 dwarven nations in different parts of the world. They should not all be the same only because they are dwarves. Let one be more classically dwarven and the other could be a dinosaur taming expansionist empire in the heart of the jungle. Wizards of the Coast reflected a little bit of these cultural differences in subraces, but don't feel limited by that and explore different cultures that might not be bound to race entirely, but are only defined by the places a person lives in. The race should define the physicality and major properties of the average people of that race as a whole, but the culture should be tied to the place where they live. A gnome settlement in the desert will have a whole different culture around food and drinking water than a settlement of gnomes alongside a river with plenty of fish. If you plan big melting pot cities or even small settlements with a multitude of different races living together, it is not natural for every race to have their own separate culture and belief system. Think about what makes a race different from other races, like different heights, lifespans, or food that they are able to eat, but try to bind them together by their culture. The race should just be a facet that influences the people, not their whole deal. This will help you create deeper characters originating from these races. Number 4. Look at your race as a whole, as well as from up close. There's a difference in the scale from which you can approach creating a race. You can look at the race as a whole, how the goblins from the hills use their surroundings and their numbers to survive against the warmongering dragonborn bandits with their better equipment. In this case, a single goblin might be inferior in one-on-one combat with a dragonborn, or in other terms, the races are balanced against each other with their numbers as one important part of the equation. Imbalance is fine on large scales and often totally fine while writing stories, but can lead to problems in D&D when individual characters from different races are not properly balanced or just don't feel like part of the race as a whole if they are. So it is really beneficial to also consider what your world building choices mean for a single member of that race and what exceptions from the average there are. Speaking of exceptions from the average, I like to let players change one of their racial attribute modifiers to reflect that individuals can differ from the average or to incorporate the backstory better into the stats. One trick that I found useful when I want to create a hive mind swarm race or a race with low numbers but really strong individuals is not to make them available for players. This makes balancing less important and gives you more creative freedom. This leads back to the question of what your world building goal is. If you want them as a storytelling device or to create interesting side characters, there is no need to balance it in a way you had to for playable races. However, if you want to create a playable race, you should definitely take a closer look at your race and design it from an individual angle first, instead of just looking at them as a group of people. Number 5. The implications on the world around the race. A great way to give your fantasy races more depth is to take your time and think about the implications of the properties of your fantasy race. How do their long lifespans affect their view on short-lived creatures? Do their fire resistance mean they have a favor for spicy food? Or that they get cold easily? This might feel like redundant information to you, but helps players a lot to bond with their characters. Adding more flavor helps you to establish these little differences that makes each race feel unique. The next step would be to keep an eye open for synergies between races. How do they affect each other and how would that influence the society of settlements where multiple races live together? As an example, we could take the fire-resistant tieflings and the masters of forgery, the dwarves. The tieflings could withstand the heat of lava melting furnaces much better and could supply a dwarven smith with high-quality metal. If you take some time of your world building to think about how certain abilities would affect the day-to-day life of your fantasy races and what that means for fashion, furniture, food and culture in general, you get races that feel like they belong in your world. These are great things for your players to explore and a great way for them to connect to your world. Number 6. Think about how to handle racism in your fantasy worlds. Our world is full of it. Too full. But elves hating dwarves and vice versa, or everyone being afraid of architects, are common tropes in fantasy worlds. In a setting where races have real differences in the way they are, there's a thin line between racial stereotypes and common knowledge. You should use this one sparsely, if at all, and make sure that your players are fine with it. It may be a great way to make unlikable characters or to create drama, however, there are so many better ways without creating a hostile environment. Make sure that it is clear that if you use racism, that your view as the world builder and the racist views of some characters are clearly separated and you are not portraying it as something positive. Keep in mind that many people are more anxious about two kinds of things, These, which is very similar but has small differences to argue and start fighting each other over, and something so alien they don't understand and in return fear it. In my understanding, this means that most fantasy races should be fine with each other. Especially the famous dwarven and elven hatred is in my view stupid in most settings. Both have different ways of living, but rarely come in contact with each other. They are different enough to not start arguing over little things, and not so different as to not being able to understand each other. So without additional reasoning and the history of your world, it can kind of feel out of place. However, if you think about why they don't like each other and craft events to further implement that idea into your world, you can turn it into something really interesting. If you use this method, try not to overdo it. We don't want the whole culture and flair of a race to be driven by racism only. We want them to be more than one-dimensional. A refreshing way to go about it is to cut racism out entirely. There are enough reasons for people to fight or have drama that you can use. The Netflix show She-Ra is a great example of how to create a great story without using racism, even with many different fantasy races in it. Number 7. Make your races unique and not just like humans. Fantasy races have often a problem if done wrong. They feel like humans with a slightly different shade of rainbow color and maybe a small gimmick. This happened to me when I ran Pathfinder the first time. I got my hands on the Advanced Races guide and wanted to include all of them and make them playable for everyone. This led to a lot of characters that acted like humans and felt like humans. The players mostly choose these races for their stats. I did not really offer anything else to begin with, and how could I, with all these different races just crammed into my world without a second thought? My world building reason was, they existed, so I have to have them in my world. That's it. The funny thing in retrospect is, I was really bothered by that. But instead of seeing that I should have put more thought into it, I blamed the author of the Advanced Race Guide and on some occasions even my players, when it was purely my choice to put these races into the game, without putting any effort into it, to be honest. Fantasy races should be more than humans, but less than humans. What do I mean with that? It is easy. A fantasy race should have something unique, something that adds value to your world in some way, but they should not just make them better than humans in every way. Elves tend to have the problem in a lot of fantasy settings. They live longer, are more skilled fighters, have better magic, and so on and so forth. In fantasy writing that can be cool, but in D&D that tends to just make humans less interesting. A great TTRPG that nails humans is Opus Anima, a small steampunk role-playing game with great and unique races. The humans there have the fastest self-healing speed and can recover from far greater wounds than any other race. We tend to take the abilities of the human body for granted, because we know nothing else. But there is nothing wrong with giving humans more than the standard adaptability they have in nearly every fantasy world. Number 8. Reskin existing races. My favorite tip to make your own races is to reskin another. Just take an existing race from the player's handbook or your favorite medium and give them a new appearance. This one might be more useful for dungeon masters and TTRPGs than for writing. If you want to add your own races to your world and don't want to worry about all the standard races being present and how to implement them, this is an especially elegant solution. Choose one with stats that fit what you have in mind for your new race, and just remodel it. Maybe change a few little things about proficiencies for certain tools and such. You don't have to worry about balancing them in respect to the other races in that way. I myself used this for the feline race in my setting. They are just halflings with the appearance of humanoid house cats. You could turn dwarves into badger people, elves into sentient beanstalks, or dragonborn into crystals filled with elemental energy. Let your imagination run free. Just make sure that your description of the new race matches the stat block roughly. These are 8 thoughts I consider when I think about fantasy races and how to improve them in my world building. Do you agree? Maybe you have other great tips for making fantasy races more interesting. Let's discuss them in the comments together. If you want to know more about my fantasy setting of Andrasil, check out my world building playlist. Or maybe you want to know how to create memorable boss fights, then check out the video I made about exactly this topic. Thanks for sticking with me till the end. Your dungeon master for this video was KorokDM, and I hope you join me in the next one.